Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, A Theory is Just a Theory, under determination in scientific theory. In this video, we're going to be looking at the question of, is science rational? With Larry Loudon and the SSK. Before we get into this video too much, I want to offer an important definition. What do I mean by irrational? You may have different understandings of irrational. What I'm going to offer here is a philosophical definition of irrational. So, irrational is a process or method is irrational if some step of it is not based on reason, rationality, or logic. If there's some part of it where you cannot rationally decide between two options. If two people might reach two contradictory conclusions after correctly following a process, then it is irrational. So, with that out of the way, let's get started on these arguments. If you haven't checked out the previous video in this series on holistic underdetermination, I would strongly advise that you do. This is following directly from the conclusions we've made in that video, and if you have objections to some of the premises that we're raising here and we're starting here, the arguments for those premises were offered in that previous video. You might want to check it out. So, with that out of the way, let's get going. We left our last video with Quine saying the unit of empirical significance is the whole of science. Or in other words, we can only test all of our hypotheses at once. If we find a problem, a contradiction, or a theory that does not correctly predict the results of an experiment, we cannot know where that problem is. We cannot know if the problem lies in our theory or in our baseline previous theories that led us to believe that that theory would correctly predict the results of a specific experiment. So, imagine that you have a theory and an experiment that claims that it's not the case. So, contradictory evidence. You could either throw out the original theory, say that this theory predicted that this would happen, the experiment shows that it didn't, therefore we should throw out the original theory. Or you could throw out previous assumptions that led you to believe that the experiment would prove the theory false, that led you to believe that the theory claims that the experiment will give us this result. You could throw out one of those previous theories. The problem is that there's no rational way to choose between these two options. There's no rule of logic or rule of reason that tells us which option we should take, whether or not we should throw out the original theory, or whether or not we should throw out some other previous theory that led us to the claim that this experiment can prove the theory false. There's no rational way to choose between them. And this is a deeper problem for all of our beliefs as well. If that wasn't a persuasive example, take a look at this one. Imagine that you hold the belief that all the buildings on Churchill Street are no more than 2 stories tall. Now imagine you encounter some sense data that disagrees with this belief, some evidence that disagrees with that belief. You could throw out the original belief. Say, well, I just saw a 3-story building on Churchill Street. I guess my belief that all the buildings on Churchill Street are no more than 2 stories tall is incorrect. You could also change your belief about your location. You could say, well, I just saw a 3-story building on this street. It seems that I'm not on Churchill Street. Perhaps you could change your belief about what 2-story buildings look like. You say, well, it appears to me that that's a 3-story building, but perhaps it's just a 2-story building that has really tall floors. It seems that you could change your mind about any number of other beliefs that led you to this contradiction as well. There are all sorts of other beliefs that you could change your mind about that would resolve this and prevent it from being a contradiction. In fact, you could just change your mind about it being a problem that there are contradictions in your belief structure. There is no rational way for us to decide between these different options. However, there's nothing rational about which belief you revise, because you eventually do revise some belief because contradictions make us psychologically uneasy. It's just simply a fact of psychology, as there's no rational way to choose which belief is wrong. It's simply a fact of psychology which belief you end up choosing to revise. Psychologically, generally, we'll throw out whichever belief we can get rid of the easiest. But that has absolutely no bearing on which belief is true, which belief is rational, or which belief is justified. It's just whichever belief is psychologically easy for us to deal with not believing at the time. In other words, whenever we revise our beliefs, we are irrational. We are not acting rationally because there is no rational principle on which we can base that revision. That is to say, there is no rational reason for us to throw out one belief over another. Just as in science, there's no rational reason for us to choose to throw out one specific theory over another when faced with disagreeing evidence. We, in fact, can preserve any belief we want, come what may. One could, if you really wanted to preserve your belief about two-story buildings in Churchill Street, start throwing out much deeper beliefs that you have, such as things about sense data. If you start seeing signs that say it is Churchill Street, and you look into the building and it in fact has 3 stories, you could start throwing out those deeper beliefs if you really want to preserve that belief. And in the face of contrary evidence, rational people may come to different conclusions. You might conclude that in fact you're not on Churchill Street, while I might conclude that I'm not seeing the building correctly, and in fact it's only 2 stories, and someone else might conclude that in fact there are buildings with 3 stories on Churchill Street. We're all acting rationally. There's no right answer. There's no correct way to revise your beliefs. So anyone that picks one of those options is irrational. They have not acted solely on rational principles. However, if we have no rational way to revise our scientific beliefs in the face of failed predictions, how then do we revise them? The answer can only be that we do it irrationally. Some members of the Sociology of Scientific Knowledge movement, the SSK, as well as some feminist science scholars, argue that the theories that are discarded are chosen based on all sorts of other things, everything from career interests to gender biases, from political affiliations to intellectual allegiances. They argue that the real reason that scientists throw out these different beliefs, or choose which beliefs to throw out and then claim they were justified by science, is actually for some personal gain in some way. Because they look at these situations and demonstrate that the evidence is underdetermined as to which theory you should get rid of. And so the scientists that are defending that they should throw out this theory because it was disproven by the evidence are simply biased because they're choosing not to throw out the other theories that they could just as easily throw out. The evidence is underdetermined, so other influences take over. Now, Larry Loudon is going to try to come to the rescue of science and show that it, in fact, is a rational pursuit, and that the SSK and these other scholars are blowing things out of proportion. He's going to say that there are 2 versions of the underdetermination thesis. There's a stronger version, which has all the consequences implied by the SSK, but in fact is undefensible. It's not able to be defended, and it's rarely defended by those people in the SSK that make all these grandiose arguments. There also is a weaker version that is and can be defended, but lacks the same drastic consequences as the stronger version. Let's take a look at how he parses this distinction. So, the weak version, according to Loudon, it is psychologically possible for a human to preserve any claim, come what may. You can hold on to that belief that the buildings on Churchill Street are no more than 2 stories tall, even as the skyscrapers rise around you. But that doesn't mean that it's rational to do so. The strong claim, on the other hand, is that it is rationally defensible to retain any belief or theory, come what may. And according to Loudon, while this claim implies that science is irrational, it can't be defended. So let's look at how he says this claim can't be defended. What Loudon's going to say is that we may not be able to choose between theories based on deductive logic alone, but he's going to expand our definition of rationality, which always makes me a little uncomfortable. But he's going to say that let's bring into logic these common ampliative principles of science and good reasoning that allow us to distinguish between alternatives. These are things that are definitely going to make me a little uncomfortable and worried about what we're classifying as logic, because deductive logic has very strict rules on what it is and what it isn't. And he says that according to these ampliative principles, we can choose between our theories rationally, and therefore science can remain rational. Let's see how this would work and if those concerns that I have will bear fruit. So, imagine we have a web of beliefs. These beliefs here at the center are kind of our deductive logical beliefs, those beliefs that would be very, very hard to get rid of. It'd be very hard for someone to believe that something is both red and not red, for example. The law of excluded middle. Then, according to Loudon, there are some beliefs that are farther away than these deductive logical beliefs, but not as far out on our web of beliefs as scientific theories. These are our scientific ampliative principles. I would guess these would look like things like Occam's razor, but I'm not sure that's exactly what Loudon is arguing for. This is just kind of an example to give you a sense of what it would be. Because Occam's razor is something that allows us to distinguish between which theory is better and which theory isn't. Then we have, on the outside of these, our scientific beliefs, our current set of scientific theories as they are. Things like the theory of evolution. Humans evolved from other animals. We have this belief structure. Now, according to Loudon, when we have some evidence that contradicts this belief structure, usually, without our ampliative principles, we are underdetermined as to which belief or which theory we should get rid of. But with the ampliative principles, they will tell us specifically, this means that you should get rid of this belief or that belief because this theory is simpler or this theory explains more, something like that. According to the ampliative principles, we are rationally determined that we should get rid of this belief over that one. However, this seems to be a problem, because it seems that our scientific ampliatives are part of the web too. They're part of the beliefs that we have, and the beliefs that are up for question and up for debate. They're not deductively true in some way. They're just beliefs that seem to be useful to us in some way. So they could be thrown out just as well. We're underdetermined as to if we should throw out whatever the ampliative tells us to, or the ampliative itself. Imagine that the ampliative tells us to throw out one specific belief, belief X. We could either throw out belief X, or say, you know what, we really like belief X. Maybe we're psychologically disposed to like it. Let's just throw out the ampliative in this case. Whichever option we pick is going to be irrational, because there's no rational way to choose which of those two things you should do. Kyle Stanford, sums it up very nicely in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Such further ampliative principles governing legitimate beliefs are, of course, themselves simply part of the web of our beliefs, and are therefore open to revision in response to recalcitrant experience. Indeed, this is even true for the principles of deductive logic and the consequent demand for particular forms of logical consistency between parts of the web itself. You might think back to that web of beliefs we have and imagine that one belief that was at the center that almost everything connected to. I imagine it being something like the law of the excluded middle, the idea that we can't have contradictions in our belief structure. If you were to throw that out, basically anything is acceptable because you're allowed to believe things that are contradictory. So there's no rational way to show what you should throw out because rationality itself is at question. Going a step farther, even beyond Loudon's argument, to say that we are going to have trouble defending our rationality because the specific way that we do logic may be at question. There are certain kinds of logic that do deny the law of the excluded middle. So it's worrisome that we would consider that the only logic or the only rationality. Therefore, however we revise our beliefs is simply going to be a fact of psychology, not a fact of rationality. Whatever we do is going to be irrational. Basically, Loudon may be able to show that the SSK and others can't justify their larger claims about the deep biases of science, that in fact, scientific theories are revised on the basis of political allegiances and all these other things. However, he's unable to demonstrate the rationality of science as he underestimates the depth of Quine's criticism, because he does not realize that scientific ampliatives are also part of our web of belief and also can be doubted. And so we are once again underdetermined as to what we should throw out in our web of belief. Therefore, science is irrational. If you have an argument against this argument, you think you can defend Loudon, or you think you have another stronger argument, please offer it in the comments below. If you're curious as to more on this topic, check out Kyle Stanford's paper in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And keep watching the series we just did, Is Science Rational? With Larry Loudon, the SSK. Next up is Are Theories Verifiable? With Contrastive Underdetermination. And finally, we're going to finish up with Are Our Theories Correct? With Transient Underdetermination. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.